The path between right and wrong isn't always clear, especially when the truth is a weapon more deadly than any gun. As a retired soldier, Ethan Ward thought his days of fighting were long behind him. But fate has a way of bringing the past back in ways we least expect. Alongside a dog that refuses to give up, he's about to uncover a secret buried deep within a project that should never have existed. What he doesn't realize is that the price of uncovering the truth will cost him everything. If you're intrigued, hit that like button, subscribe, and let us know, what do you think lies ahead? Where are you watching from? Ethan Ward had spent years trying to convince himself that silence was peace, that the absence of gunfire and chaos meant he was finally free. But as he drove through the fog-shrouded backroads of Vermont that morning, the quiet pressed against his chest like a weight he couldn't breathe under. His old Ford pickup rattled along the dirt path, the heater barely working, the dashboard cluttered with coffee stains and crumpled letters from the Veterans Affairs office that he never bothered to open. The mist blurred everything, the trees, the fences, even the sky, into one gray smear. For a man like him, that color felt familiar, the color of memory, the color of loss. He rubbed the scar on his knuckles and kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was somewhere else, buried in years he didn't talk about anymore. The sound came suddenly, faint, frantic something scraping against the gravel behind him. He looked in the rearview mirror, squinting through the fog. At first it looked like a shadow skipping along the road, but then the shape grew clearer. A small German Shepherd puppy, maybe 3 months old, was running after his truck, its limp heavy, its ribs visible beneath thin, dirty fur. Ethan frowned, lifting his foot off the gas. "What in the world?" he muttered. The pup's legs shook with exhaustion, yet it kept going, eyes locked on the taillights, as if afraid to lose them. Ethan pulled over to the side, the crunch of gravel echoing in the stillness. The puppy stumbled to a stop a few feet behind him and collapsed, chest-heaving, tiny whimpers lost in the wind. He stepped out, boots sinking into damp soil, and knelt beside the trembling animal. Up close he could see the story written across its body, the burn marks on its collar, the mud-caked paws, the faint smell of smoke in its fur. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he said softly. The pup looked up, meeting his eyes. Those eyes weren't just pleading. They were commanding, filled with a strange, urgent knowing. Before Ethan could reach for it, the puppy pushed itself up, took 2 shaky steps forward, and clamped its teeth gently around the cuff of his sleeve. Then it turned its head toward the tree line, toward the dense, dark stretch of forest, where no road led. "You want me to go there?" he asked, half to himself. The pup whimpered again, tugging with all the strength left in its frail body. Ethan sighed, rubbing his neck. "Damn it, kid. I don't chase ghosts anymore." But when he tried to pull his arm free, the pup wouldn't let go. It looked at him like it was begging him to understand. Something stirred in him, an echo of the instinct that had once made him run into burning buildings and drag wounded men out under fire. He lifted the puppy gently, feeling its bones through the thin fur, and set it in the passenger seat of his truck. "All right," he said quietly, starting the engine. "Show me." The puppy rested its head on the window frame, eyes fixed on the woods outside. Ethan followed the narrow dirt path that curved deeper into the trees. The fog thickened, and the smell of smoke grew stronger, mingling with the damp scent of pine and soil. He slowed to a crawl. "You smell it too, don't you?" he said, glancing at the puppy. It gave a faint bark tail, twitching weakly. The deeper he drove, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees closed in their trunks, blackened in places as though touched by fire. Branches hung low, heavy with dew and ash. Ethan's pulse quickened. Memories flashed the scent of burning, the color of smoke, the sound of a heartbeat pounding in his ears, while men yelled his name. He blinked hard, gripping the wheel until his knuckles turned white. "Not there, Ward." "Stay here," he muttered. When the road ended, he stopped. The puppy stood on unsteady legs, pawing at the door. It wanted out. Ethan stepped into the cold air, the silence swallowing him whole. The world felt suspended, the kind of stillness that happens right before something breaks. He circled around and opened the passenger door. The pup jumped down, wobbled once, then began limping toward the woods again, nose to the ground. "You're crazy," Ethan whispered, following anyway. The forest floor was slick, covered with leaves that stuck to his boots. He caught the glint of something metallic near a tree stump, a fragment of glass blackened and curved. It wasn't a bottle. It looked like part of a headlight. The puppy sniffed it and barked softly, then kept moving. A few yards ahead, Ethan spotted a deeper scar in the earth, the mark of something heavy that had slid through mud tire tracks, recent and messy. His gut tightened. He looked around the fog, blurring the world into ghosts. The puppy stopped again, paw bleeding slightly, but refused to rest. It turned back and looked at him, those amber eyes glowing faintly against the gray. He crouched down beside it. "All right, soldier," he said, his voice low, rough, but filled with something close to respect. "Lead the way." The puppy gave a soft whine and pressed its tiny head against his boot before limping forward once more. They moved together, two survivors, drawn by the same invisible pull, one trying to understand the other, trying to make him see. As the mist deepened, Ethan could hear something distant, a faint hum like electricity or static whispering through the trees. He froze, listening. The puppy stopped, two ears perked. The sound was coming from a head buried in the forest's belly. Whatever it wasn't natural. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder bag, the old instinct of readiness returning before he realized it. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest echo of something burning, not fresh, but recent enough to sting his throat. The pup whimpered again and pressed close to his leg. He crouched, stroking its head gently. "We'll find it," he whispered. "Whatever's calling you out here." The forest swallowed them whole, the canopy so dense that even the faint morning light struggled to seep through. Ethan's boots sank into wet soil, each step heavy with a sense of intrusion. The smell of damp pine and ash mixed in the air, reminding him of those forgotten nights overseas, when forests weren't peaceful, but full of hidden eyes. The little German shepherd puppy pressed forward beside him, trembling with exhaustion, yet refusing to stop. Its limp had worsened, and every few steps it stumbled, leaving tiny smears of blood on the brown leaves. Ethan wanted to scoop it up again, but something about the way it pushed onward made him hold back. It was leading him somewhere, and it needed to walk, even if it hurt. He followed silently, scanning every direction, every sound. There were no birds here, no wind rustling branches, just the slow rhythm of his breathing and the occasional whimper from the pup. The fog that had clung to the road earlier now hung between the trees like gauze, thick and strange, muting even his own footsteps. He could see just far enough to catch the glint of moisture on pine needles, but not far enough to know what waited ahead. His mind replayed the last few minutes, the broken collar, the smell of gasoline, the glass fragment that looked like a headlight. Something had gone wrong out here, and whatever it was, it hadn't happened long ago. The pup's head suddenly shot up, ears twitching despite its weakness. It gave a soft, uneasy growl and hobbled toward a slope where the ground curved downward. Ethan crouched, examining the soil. Mud was disturbed in overlapping circles, deep impressions that weren't natural. Tire tracks not wide enough for heavy machinery, more like a small vehicle that had veered off the road. He brushed the edges with his fingers. They were still damp. That meant within the last 12 hours, maybe less. "Someone crashed," he murmured. The puppy looked up at him, whining softly. He glanced down the slope. Through the thin fog, the ground disappeared into shadows and tangled roots. He could feel the faint vibration of water nearby, a stream or runoff. He gripped a low branch for balance and started descending. The pup followed, sliding a little on the wet soil. When they reached the bottom, Ethan froze. The trees here were scorched on one side, their bark blistered and black. The smell of burned metal clung to the air. It wasn't a forest fire. It was localized, small but violent. Something had exploded. His pulse quickened. He crouched low, feeling the cold earth beneath his hand. The puppy sniffed near a cracked fence post lying in the dirt. On the sharp edge of the wood, a tiny streak of blood glistened fresh against the brown surface. Ethan looked closer. The cut on the pup's paw matched it perfectly. It must have tried to crawl through here earlier, injured itself, and turned back to find help. His chest tightened at the thought of it wandering alone in the dark, scared and hurt, yet determined enough to find him miles away. "You're tougher than you look," he whispered, reaching out to rub behind its ear. The pup licked his knuckles once, then immediately limped toward a patch of disturbed ground nearby. Ethan followed and knelt again. There, half buried under leaves and pine needles, was a long black smear across the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged. At the end of the mark, the ground dipped into a narrow rut, filled with shallow water. A reflection shimmered metal again. He reached in and pulled out a bent license plate, the numbers warped by heat. His heart slowed. Whoever had crashed here didn't just hit a tree. The vehicle had caught fire. And yet there were no human remains, no sign of a driver, no clothing or debris beyond fragments. Someone had cleaned up, or someone had survived and run. He looked around, scanning for footprints. The soil was churned in places, but mostly smooth. The fog had likely erased what little evidence there was. The puppy barked sharply, breaking the silence. Ethan looked over and saw it pawing at something buried deeper under wet leaves. He knelt again, brushed the muck aside, and uncovered a small torn piece of fabric, faded gray, stiff with soot. He turned it over. Stitched into one corner was a patch he recognized instantly, a unit insignia, the emblem of a retired military K-9 division. His stomach tightened. He knew that patch. He'd worn it himself 2 decades ago. The puppy whimpered and pressed its nose against the cloth. Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of recognition sinking in. This wasn't random. The dog wasn't leading him toward an accident, it was leading him back to something tied to his past. He straightened, scanning the dark wall of trees beyond the broken fence. There was still a faint glow there, faint enough to question if it was real or imagined, but then he heard it a low crack in the distance, followed by the faint, metallic rattle of movement. Someone else was nearby. He crouched, low instinct taking over, motioning the puppy to stay quiet. It lowered itself instantly, trembling but obedient. Ethan peered through the fog. The sound faded, replaced by the whisper of rain hitting pine needles. He waited another minute, then exhaled slowly. "We're not alone," he whispered. The puppy tilted its head, ears, twitching eyes, reflecting fear and faith at once. Ethan reached down and lifted it carefully, holding it close against his chest. Its heartbeat fluttered against his ribs, fast and fragile. "It's all right, little one," he said softly. "We'll figure this out." He turned and made his way toward a narrow trail barely visible among the ferns, hoping it would lead back toward the road or some sign of safety. The fog thickened again, closing behind him like a curtain. Every sound seemed amplified, his breath, the squelch of his boots, the faint whimper of the pup. Somewhere above them a crow screamed once and went silent. Ethan's grip tightened. He didn't know yet that this silent stretch of forest had been hiding more than just an accident. There was a reason the pup had found him, and a reason the woods felt like they were watching him back. As he stepped through the last of the burned trees, he caught sight of something glinting ahead, a small metallic badge nailed into the trunk of a pine. It was old, rusted, and stamped with faint letters barely legible through the corrosion, "Property of Hollow Ridge Research." He frowned. He'd never heard of it, yet something in the name tugged at memory like a half-remembered briefing from long ago. The deeper Ethan and the puppy moved into the woods, the heavier the air became pressing on them, like the breath of something unseen. The trees grew closer together, their trunks black with soot and age, their roots twisting over the earth like veins. Ethan could hear the faint hum of insects, the rustle of distant branches bending in the windless dark, and the soft, shallow panting of the little German shepherd resting in his arms. Its fur was still warm, but sticky with dried blood, its tiny heartbeat steady against his chest, fragile but stubborn. He stopped beside a fallen tree and crouched, letting the pup down gently onto the moss. It limped to a patch of dirt and began sniffing, nose-twitching tail low. Ethan watched as it pawed the ground once, then stared toward a cluster of thick pines where the fog was denser. His instincts prickled again. Something about this place didn't feel right. He adjusted his jacket, unzipped one pocket, and felt the cold edge of the combat knife he had carried since the war. It wasn't fear guiding him now. It was habit, an old rhythm of survival. The puppy took a few steps forward and scratched at a tree trunk. Ethan moved closer, shining his flashlight along the bark. There were markings, faint but unmistakable shallow claw prints near the base like a small animal had tried to climb. But just above them were deeper grooves, broader, angrier, carved into the wood with strength that didn't belong to the pup. He reached up and touched one of the deep scars. The wood flaked under his finger. Whatever made them had done so recently. The pup whimpered and pressed itself against his boot ears, flattened. "You were with someone, weren't you?" he whispered. And something went wrong. The puppy's gaze lingered on the forest ahead, as if the answer was out there in the fog. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold. He crouched lower and scanned the ground. The earth was disturbed in patches scuffed by paws and heavier prints alike. There were drag marks too faint, but stretching between the trees. He followed them with his light squinting through the mist until it caught something small glinting beneath a root, a broken dog tag half buried in mud. He picked it up, wiped it clean with his thumb, and froze. The letters were faded, but still readable. K, 9 Unit 12, Luna. The name struck him like a blow. He had heard it before, years ago, whispered among handlers who worked with service dogs in classified missions. Luna had been one of them, trained for search and rescue, retired after an explosion overseas. He closed his fist around the tag and looked at the puppy. Its ears twitched at the name, eyes glimmering in the pale light. "She's your mother," he said quietly. The pup gave a weak bark, as if agreeing. Ethan crouched again and rubbed its fur. "If she's out here, we'll find her." But before he could take another step, a sound snapped through the stillness, the quick, sharp crunch of movement behind him. Ethan froze. The pup pressed itself into the ground, silent now. He slowly turned off his flashlight, letting his eyes adjust to the dark. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, deep among the trees, a shadow shifted tall, deliberate, too smooth to be an animal. He reached into his jacket and drew his knife, the handle fitting perfectly into his palm muscle memory, waking in his bones. "Who's there?" He called his voice, low, calm, the tone of a man who'd faced worse. No answer, only the whisper of mist rolling through branches. He waited. Another movement, closer, this time maybe 20 feet away. He crouched, lowering his profile, one hand on the ground, the other gripping the blade tight. His heartbeat thudded in his ears, not from fear, but focus. The puppy trembled beside him, eyes wide, watching the same direction. Ethan narrowed his gaze and caught at a flicker of motion, like someone slipping behind a tree. Then silence again. He didn't move for nearly a full minute. When he finally stood, his boots barely made a sound. "Come on," he murmured, sheathing the knife. "We're not staying here." He picked up the pup, cradling it against his chest, and began moving through the trees, again slower now, every sense on edge. The fog thickened, clinging to his face, filling his lungs with moisture. Every shadow looked like a figure, every gust of wind like a whisper. He forced his mind to stay steady. The forest wasn't an enemy, just a place carrying the echoes of one. The path narrowed until he reached a clearing. At the center stood a cluster of broken crates half buried under vines. He knelt beside one, brushing away the moss. The wood was marked with faded stencils, property of Hollow Ridge Research, the same name from the rusted sign he had found earlier. He pried one open with the tip of his knife. Inside lay a collection of metal collars, each tagged with small chips and ID codes. They were military-grade tracking devices. Some were bent, others burned. One still blinked faintly, a dying red light pulsing every few seconds. He picked it up, turning it over. The serial number ended in the same digits etched on Luna's tag. "You were part of this," he whispered, staring at the pup. "They used you, and someone didn't want the world to find out." The dog whimpered softly, curling closer. Before Ethan could react, another sound cut through the quiet, a rustle heavier this time, followed by the faint crunch of boots on gravel. He ducked behind a tree, clutching the pup close, the blinking collar still in his hand. Through the mist, he saw a faint beam of light sweeping back and forth, a flashlight. Then another. Two men silhouettes in heavy coats, moving cautiously, but with purpose. "Check the crates," one said, his voice muffled but deep. "If the trackers are still transmitting, we can't leave them here." The second man grunted. "What about the dog?" "Find it." Ethan's muscles locked. He waited, holding his breath, heart pounding. The puppy tensed in his arms, trying not to move. One of the men kicked a crate, muttering a curse. The other stepped closer to the clearing's edge. His light passed within feet of Ethan's hiding spot, glinting off the wet bark. For a second, Ethan thought it was over. Then a branch snapped somewhere deeper in the woods, a natural sound, maybe a deer. The men turned toward it. "Over there," one shouted, and they ran off in the opposite direction. The forest floor grew darker the farther Ethan pushed through it, and though dawn had broken somewhere above, its light could not pierce the heavy pines. The mist thinned into low smoke, rising in tendrils between the trunks, smelling faintly of metal and rot. Ethan moved quietly, one arm around the exhausted puppy, his knife still within reach, his senses alert. Every few steps he stopped and listened, letting the forest speak its silent language. The air had weight, as if something mournful hung in it. The men he'd heard earlier were gone, now their voices swallowed by distance, but the unease they left behind clung to his mind. He had been hunted before, and he knew that kind of silence, the kind that meant someone was waiting for the world to breathe again before they struck. The puppy stirred weakly, licking the back of his hand as if to remind him they weren't alone. "I know," he whispered. "We keep moving." He followed the faint trail of disturbed leaves and broken twigs that wound between the trees. The ground dipped gradually until it opened into a hollow lined with moss and half-burned grass. The smell of smoke here was stronger, fresher, tinged with something he couldn't name, life fading into the earth. He set the pup down, and it immediately began limping forward, nose low, ears twitching. Ethan followed, heart tightening with every sound. The pup stopped near a mound of wet leaves and started scratching frantically, whining deep in its throat. Ethan knelt beside it, brushing the debris away with his hand. What he uncovered made his breath hitch. A full-grown German shepherd lying motionless, her fur blackened in patches, her flank rising shallowly with what little breath she had left. Her eyes were half open, dull, but not lifeless, reflecting the faint silver of morning light. Beneath her chest, pressed against her belly, was another smaller shape, wrapped in a torn canvas tarp. Ethan gently moved the mother dog's paw aside and pulled the tarp open. Inside lay another puppy, still and cold, too small to have survived the night. His throat tightened. The surviving pup whined and crawled toward the older dog, pressing its face against her neck. For a moment the mother's eyes flickered. She raised her head weakly, took a single, trembling breath, and nudged the little one closer before her strength failed again. Ethan knelt in silence, a lump burning in his throat. He could see now that her back legs were twisted unnaturally, likely broken in the wreck. She must have dragged herself miles through the mud to bring the surviving pup somewhere safe. "You didn't even stop," he whispered. "You kept going." The dog's chest lifted once, then fell. Ethan reached under her chin and found the metal tag hanging from her collar. He wiped it clean and read the engraving, "Luna Service K9 Ret." His pulse skipped. The same name as on the tag he found earlier. The same dog he'd heard stories about. "You're Luna," he murmured. "You were trying to save them." The puppy licked Luna's muzzle, whimpering, its voice soft and cracked like grief itself. Ethan swallowed hard. He slid his hand gently under the older dog's head, lifting it onto his lap. Her breathing rattled shallow, barely there. He whispered to her like he would to a dying comrade, voice rough but tender. "You did good, Luna. You got him out. You made it." The dog's ear twitched faintly at the sound of her name. He could feel her heart slowing beneath his palm, each beat weaker than the last. The forest around them was still the only movement, the rising of mist over the clearing. When her chest stilled completely, the puppy let out a sound that didn't belong to something so small, a broken howl that echoed through the trees like a plea. Ethan clenched his jaw, fighting the sting behind his eyes. He set Luna down gently, straightened the tarp around her, and whispered, "You're not alone now. I'll take it from here." But even as he spoke, a noise cut through the quiet, rustling, faint but deliberate, not wind or animal. He turned sharply, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Then another sound, a metallic click, distant but unmistakable. Safety off a rifle. His instincts flared alive. He scooped up the puppy, ducking low behind a fallen log. The pup whimpered softly, pressing into his jacket. He held it still and listened. A beam of light flickered through the fog, sweeping in slow arcs. Voices followed male calm, searching. "We found the track again," one said. "2 sets of prints now." Ethan cursed silently. They'd followed him. He peered over the log, spotting 2 figures moving through the haze, their silhouettes distorted by mist, but close enough to see the weapons slung across their backs. One bent down, examining the ground where Luna's body lay. "It's her," the man said. "She didn't make it. What about the pup still alive? The signal's faint, but it's moving, then so is he." Ethan pulled back, muscles tensed, heart hammering. They had trackers, probably embedded chips from the old K9 program. Luna's collar, maybe even the surviving pup's tag, was still transmitting. He needed to move fast. He reached for the tag around Luna's neck, ripped it off, and buried it deep in the mud beside her. The metal was cold against his fingers, the engraved letters disappearing beneath the dirt. He whispered one last time, "Rest easy, girl," then rose and slipped into the trees, with the pup tucked beneath his coat. Every movement had to be silent now. He stepped carefully between roots, his breath controlled, counting seconds between heartbeats. The fog helped hide him, but it also swallowed direction, and the forest no longer felt neutral. It felt alive, pulsing with unseen eyes. Behind him, the men's voices grew fainter, but the sound of the puppy's weak breathing reminded him that the danger wasn't over. "Hang in there, kid," he murmured, stroking its ear. "We're gonna make it out." After a while, the terrain began to rise again. Through the trees, he caught a faint glimmer of water, a creek. He followed it uphill, hoping to lose any trail the pursuers could track. When he reached the edge, he knelt and dipped his hand into the cold stream, then poured a few drops into the puppy's mouth. It drank weakly, tail-twitching once. He smiled faintly. "That's it. That's the spirit." He tore a strip from his sleeve and wrapped it gently around its wounded paw. Blood soaked through quickly, but it would hold for now. He looked back once more toward the direction they had come from. The fog had thickened again, blurring the clearing into a gray ocean. Somewhere out there lay Luna's body, still and brave, guarding the space where love had burned itself out to protect life. "You didn't have to be his mother," he whispered, voice breaking. "But you were anyway." The gunshot tore through the air before Ethan even had time to turn the bullet, ripping bark from the pine tree inches from his head. Instinct took over. He hit the ground hard, rolling behind a fallen trunk as another shot cracked through the clearing. The sound echoed in the hollow silence like thunder in a canyon. The puppy screamed a sound more human than animal, and Ethan pulled it tight against his chest, feeling its tiny heart hammer against him. "Easy, easy, I got you," he whispered through clenched teeth. The forest was alive now, with noise, footsteps crunching through leaves, low voices shouting in clipped commands. His mind flashed to the battlefield, to the endless rhythm of return fire and dirt exploding around him. But this wasn't a war zone. This was supposed to be over. Still, his body remembered everything. He peeked over the edge of the log, just long enough to catch the glint of a scope, reflecting through the mist, faint silver deliberate. A rifle. They were still out there scanning the clearing where Luna's body lay. He looked toward the dog's resting place and felt a deep ache twist inside him. Whoever these people were, they weren't going to let anyone learn what happened here. "They're cleaning up," he muttered under his breath. He glanced down at the pup, whose breathing came in quick, terrified bursts. "You brought me into this, kid," he said softly, gripping his knife tighter, "and now we're both in it." The air filled with the metallic scent of gunpowder and damp bark. He waited for the silence between the shots, that single moment when men shift positions, then crawled backward, dragging himself and the puppy toward a slope covered in fern and moss. The next shot cracked overhead, showering them with splinters. He ducked lower, his shoulder slamming against a rock. The pain was sharp, but clean. He ignored it. Survival came first. He moved until the sounds faded into echoes behind them, until the forest swallowed the noise like it never happened. Only then did he stop chest-heaving sweat cold on his neck. The puppy whimpered softly against him, its paw bleeding again from the strain. He tore off another strip of fabric from his sleeve and wrapped the wound tighter, whispering reassurance as he barely believed himself. "You're okay. I got you. You're gonna make it." But when he looked up, his heart froze. Not 20 yards ahead, hidden behind vines and ivy, sat the skeleton of a vehicle. A pickup truck burned down to black steel, its frame twisted like a carcass. He crept closer, lowering the pup to the ground beside him. The air around the wreck still smelled faintly of gasoline. When he brushed away the ash from the front plate, his stomach turned. The military seal was still visible, melted but intact. The numbers beneath it matched the pattern he knew too well: tactical registration for government transport. "So this is it," he whispered. "This is where she came from." He climbed up the side of the wreck boots, scraping metal, and peered inside. The steering wheel had fused into the dash wires, curled and melted. He brushed soot from the floorboard and found a flash drive fused to the plastic beneath the passenger seat. It had been half melted by heat, but still recognizable. He slipped it into his pocket without thinking. Whatever was on it, someone had wanted it gone. The puppy barked weakly behind him, nose twitching at the smell of oil. He climbed down quickly, glancing through the trees. The men hadn't followed him yet, but he could sense their direction by the faint trail of crushed leaves behind the ridge. He needed to move before they circled around. He crouched and whispered to the pup, "We can't go back. We go north." The puppy wagged its tail once as if it understood. He picked it up and began climbing uphill through the brush, every step a strain against gravity and fatigue. The ground was slick with mud, and twice he slipped, catching himself against roots. His leg burned where a piece of bark had sliced through his pants. The puppy whined softly, resting its chin on his arm, eyes half closed. "Not yet," Ethan murmured, forcing his breath steady. "We're not done." The climb ended at a ridge that overlooked a deep ravine, and from there he could see faint movement below flashlights, small and sharp in the fog. They were searching methodically, sweeping side to side. He crouched low, barely breathing. He couldn't go down, couldn't go back. His only chance was across. To his left, a fallen tree spanned the ravine like a natural bridge. It was narrow, slick with moss, but strong enough to hold weight. He tightened his grip on the puppy, muttering, "Don't look down," though the words were more for himself. Each step on that log felt like a lifetime. The forest groaned under his boots, the distance below a dizzying blur of gray. Halfway across a crack, split the air again, a rifle round, punching through the wood near his feet. He flinched, almost slipping. Another shot followed closer, this time splintering bark inches from his hand. The puppy yelped. He dropped flat, shielding it with his body. "Hold on," he shouted through the ringing in his ears. He crawled the rest of the way, dragging himself by his elbows, until his hands hit dirt again. Then he ran, lungs burning, crashing through branches, until the noise behind him disappeared completely. When he finally stopped, he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The puppy curled up in his lap, trembling but alive. Rain began to fall again, light at first, then harder, drumming against the leaves. The world blurred through the haze of exhaustion and fear, but Ethan forced himself to stay alert. He knew what those men were doing. They weren't chasing witnesses. They were erasing history. Luna's unit, that research labeled the tracking collars, it all connected to something the government wanted buried. And somehow a broken-down veteran and a half-dead puppy were standing in the middle of it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the melted flash drive, staring at its warped metal casing. "You're worth killing for," he muttered. "Let's find out why." The puppy lifted its head, ears twitching at the rain eyes, reflecting the faint shimmer of lightning in the distance. Ethan looked around, scanning for shelter. A cluster of old ranger cabins stood beyond the tree-lined roofs caved in, but walls still standing. He carried the pup through the mud and ducked inside the first one he found. The room smelled of mold and rust, but it was dry. He set the puppy on a pile of old blankets and tore off his soaked jacket, wringing it out by the doorway. The dog shivered uncontrollably, so he wrapped it in the fabric, sitting close enough that their warmth mingled. "You were never a stray," he whispered, brushing dirt from its fur. "You're the last piece of something they tried to destroy." The storm raged through the mountains like it was alive, its wind tearing through the forest in low, guttural moans that carried between the trees. Lightning split the sky, and thunder followed close behind, shaking the ground, as if the heavens themselves were at war. Ethan had seen storms like this before, not made of weather, but of men and memory. His leg burned with every step, blood seeping through the fabric he had tied around it. The shrapnel had lodged deep when the bullet struck the log near his knee earlier. He hadn't noticed at first through the rush of adrenaline, but now every nerve screamed in agony. Still he carried on, the puppy clutched to his chest, under his coat, both of them soaked and trembling. The pup whimpered softly, licking at his fingers as if it could taste the pain through his skin. "Don't worry," he muttered through gritted teeth. "I've had worse." He stumbled over a root, nearly falling, but caught himself on a branch, slick with rain. His vision blurred around the edges, the world shrinking to the sound of his ragged breath and the faint heartbeat of the tiny creature he refused to let go of. The forest thinned slowly, giving way to the faint suggestion of the main road, a dark ribbon glimmering under rain and headlights that didn't belong to him. His old truck was somewhere west, parked miles away from where all this began. But between him and safety lay open ground, and whoever was hunting him. He stopped behind a cluster of wet boulders, lowering the puppy to the ground for a moment to catch his breath. The little dog nudged at his leg, whimpering. Ethan smiled faintly, despite the pain. "You still got more fight than I do," he whispered. The thunder cracked again, masking the sound of an approaching engine. He froze. Through the sheets of rain, a pair of headlights flickered down the narrow forest trail ahead, too controlled to be random. He ducked lower, peering through the dripping ferns. A black SUV crawled along the path, its tires crunching over gravel. The beam from a mounted flashlight swept side to side, scanning the tree line. Voices echoed faintly through the storm, the same ones from before. "Spread out," a man shouted. "Find the old guy." He couldn't have gone far. Ethan's grip tightened on his knife, though he knew he was in no shape for a fight. The puppy pressed against his side tail, low, trembling, but silent. He could hear the men stepping out of the vehicle, their boots sinking into mud. "Check the ravine," one said. "He might have gone down there when we fired." Another replied, "If he's bleeding, we'll find him. Dogs can't survive a hit like that." Ethan's chest tightened. He looked down at the pup. Its eyes were wide, alert, fixed on the direction of the voices. He could see its tiny chest rise and fall. The way its breathing changed, the dog wasn't afraid now. It was focused. Lightning flashed, and for a heartbeat the world turned white. In that instant, Ethan saw the outline of 3 men moving through the trees like ghosts. He knew what came next. They were going to sweep this section, and once they found Luna's body, they'd come for him. "Stay quiet," he whispered. But before he could move, pain flared sharp and white in his leg, and he lost balance, crashing against a rock. The sound was enough to draw attention. A voice shouted, "Over there!" The puppy startled, whining, then slipped out from under his coat. No, Ethan hissed, reaching for it, but the pup darted away through the ferns, barking a shrill, desperate sound that cut through the rain like a siren. The gunman turned immediately, flashlights swinging toward the sound. "There it is," the signal's still active one yelled. Without thinking, Ethan forced himself up, ignoring the pain, dragging his body through the mud in the opposite direction. His palms tore open against the stones, blood mixing with rainwater, but he kept moving. The puppy barked again, farther now, pulling the hunters away. "Keep it distracted," one shouted, and their footsteps thundered through the forest, fading as they chased the echoing cries. Ethan gritted his teeth, each crawl sending shocks of agony up his injured leg. He could barely breathe. His mind screamed at him to stop, but he kept going, following the faint glow he recognized through the trees, the reflection of his truck's headlights, still dimly visible from where he had parked it hours ago. The memory of the road, the sound of the engine, the feeling of control, all of it pulled him forward. His hand slipped on wet bark, and he hit the ground hard, gasping. He clawed at the earth, dragging himself until his fingers brushed cold metal. He looked up, barely conscious, and saw the familiar dented grille of his truck looming out of the fog. Relief hit him like a wave of warmth in a frozen world. He pulled himself upright, opened the door with trembling hands, and collapsed inside his breath, coming in broken gasps. The seat was wet, his coat heavy with rain, the air thick with the scent of blood and mud. He turned the key once, nothing. The second time, the engine coughed. On the third, it roared weakly to life, sputtering. He looked through the windshield, waiting for the puppy to appear, praying to see a flicker of movement in the dark. Nothing. Just rain and lightning. "Come on, kid," he whispered, voice cracking. "You did this for me, now you come back." He put the truck in gear tires, spinning on the wet ground, and turned it toward the sound of shouting in the distance. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't leave it behind. The rain blurred the world into streaks of gray. He drove until the shouting vanished, until the only sound left was the steady hum of the engine and the pounding of his own heart. Then he saw it, a small shape stumbling out from the tree line, soaked and shaking, limping toward the road. Ethan slammed the brakes, jumped out, and ran toward it. The puppy collapsed into his arms, covered in mud, but alive. He held it close, pressing his face into its wet fur. "You're insane," he said hoarsely. "You just saved me." The pup whined weakly, licking the side of his face before going limp against his chest. He carried it back to the truck and set it on the seat, wrapping it in the blanket from the back. For the first time since the shooting started, Ethan allowed himself to breathe. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving behind the throbbing pain of his leg wound. He reached into his jacket, pulling out the melted flash drive and turning it in his fingers. The rain had washed away most of the soot, revealing a faint serial number stamped into the casing. He memorized it, whispering it under his breath like a code he wasn't meant to know. Then he looked at the puppy again, its chest rising faintly shallow, but steady. "We're going to find out what they did to her," he murmured, "and why they wanted you dead." The headlights cut through the fog ahead, illuminating the long road back down the mountain. Behind them, the forest rumbled alive with the sounds of the storm. He pressed the accelerator, the truck groaning as it climbed. In the rearview mirror, he could see faint movement in the trees, distant lights, maybe flashlights, maybe only lightning, but he didn't slow. The rain hit the windshield like shrapnel as the old pickup rattled along the dirt road, its tires sliding over mud and broken branches. Ethan's hands shook on the steering wheel, blood from his leg wound dripping onto the floor mat. His vision blurred between lightning flashes, each one exposing the nightmare of the forest receding behind him. The puppy lay wrapped in a blanket on the passenger seat, unmoving chest rising too slowly for comfort. He stole glances at it between turns, his throat tight with panic. "Hang in there, kid," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Just a little further." The road curved sharply, and the headlights swept across the outline of a small wooden structure tucked beneath a ridge, a ranger hut half collapsed but still standing. Relief hit him like air after drowning. He slowed the truck parked beside the hut and shoved the door open. The rain hit him immediately, cold and merciless. He lifted the limp puppy from the seat, shielding it with his body, and stumbled through the mud toward the shelter. The hut door was swollen shut from moisture, and he had to shoulder it open, the hinges shrieking into the storm. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and dust, but it was dry. He laid the puppy on the floor near an old iron stove and pulled the blanket tighter around it. The little dog didn't move. Ethan dropped to his knees, shaking from exhaustion, the adrenaline that had fueled him for hours now burning out. "Don't you quit on me," he whispered, pressing 2 fingers to its chest. The heartbeat was faint, but there. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. He needed fire warmth, anything to keep it alive. He searched the shelves and found a few old ranger supplies, a tin of matches, some dry bark, a rusted hatchet. His hands worked mechanically, slicing bark into strips, building a small pile in the stove. His fingers trembled so much that he almost dropped the matches, but after 3 tries, the spark caught, and a small flame flickered to life. It grew quickly, throwing trembling shadows across the walls. He tore open a first aid kit he'd taken from the truck and cleaned the puppy's wounds, wrapping its tiny leg in gauze. The little creature twitched, but didn't wake. He sat back, staring at the firelight, reflecting in its wet fur. The storm outside was relentless wind howling through the cracks like the moans of ghosts. He leaned against the wall leg, throbbing, and for a long moment he thought about Luna, the mother who had crawled miles through agony to protect this helpless thing. He remembered her still body under the tarp, the way her eyes had looked like they were guarding something even in death. He'd seen soldiers die that way with purpose carved into their final expression. He had promised to finish what she started, but now that promise felt impossible. He reached over and placed his hand on the puppy's head, whispering, "You're safe now. You're not dying on me." The wind screamed harder, shaking the windows. The fire crackled low. His eyes drifted shut. When he woke again, the flames were nearly out. He blinked, confused by how much darker the world had become. His leg ached fiercely, and the storm had not eased. He turned to the side, instinctively searching for the small figure beside him, but the blanket was empty. His breath caught. "No," he muttered, crawling forward. "No, no, no." The door had blown open halfway, rain lashing the floorboards. He grabbed the flashlight, scanned the corners, the shelves, the shadows. Nothing. "Where the hell are you?" he shouted over the storm, his voice cracking with panic. He stepped outside into the downpour, limping through mud up to his ankles. The forest was a wall of gray and thunder. Lightning flared, and for a split second he saw movement near the tree line, a small, stumbling silhouette trying to climb the ridge. Kitty yelled. The shape paused, turned, then collapsed. He didn't think he ran, ignoring the fire in his leg, the mud sucking at his boots. The rain stung his face, but he pushed harder, falling to his knees beside the tiny body. The puppy was soaked, trembling, its fur streaked with blood from a fresh wound grazing its shoulder. A bullet had cut across, just missing bone. "You stupid, brave little thing," he whispered, scooping it up. "You went looking for me." He carried it back to the hut, slamming the door behind him, breathing hard. He set the puppy down near the stove, relit the fire with shaking hands, and wrapped it in his jacket. The dog's breathing was shallow, but steady. He tore the sleeve off his flannel shirt, cleaned the wound with alcohol, and tied it tight. The pup whimpered, eyes half opening to look at him. He smiled, the kind of smile that hurt to wear. "You're a fighter." "Same as me," he murmured. The dog rested its head in his palm, eyes fluttering closed, trusting him completely. Ethan exhaled, feeling the tears come before he could stop them. It wasn't just relief, it was everything, the guilt, the grief, the exhaustion. He hadn't cried in years, not since the day he buried the flag that covered his wife's coffin. But now, watching this little life cling to the world with such fragile stubbornness, he broke. The tears came hot and fast, and he didn't fight them. He pressed his forehead against the pup's fur, his voice shaking. "I thought I was done fighting," he whispered. "Guess I was wrong." The fire glowed brighter, the warmth filling the small room like breath returning to a long, dead heart. The dog stirred again, curling closer to him, its tail twitching once before falling still. Outside, the thunder rolled away slowly, retreating into the distance. The worst of the storm had passed. Ethan leaned back against the wall, staring into the flames. For the first time in years, he didn't feel empty. He felt connected to this animal, to Luna, to every life that had refused to give up, even when the world tried to erase it. The wind softened to a whisper, and through the broken window, faint morning light began to creep in. He reached for the melted flash drive in his pocket, turning it over in his fingers. The rain had cleaned the soot away completely now, and beneath the metal casing a faint emblem appeared, the same insignia etched into his own service medal, one he hadn't looked at in over a decade. The realization hit him slowly. Luna's unit hadn't been shut down. It had been buried, hidden under a name that no longer existed. Hollow Ridge, he muttered. The morning came slow, and gray light spilling weakly through the cracks of the ranger hut, painting the air in muted silver. Ethan woke to the sound of shallow breathing beside him. The puppy curled tight against his ribs. For a brief moment he thought he'd dreamed the night before the gunfire, the rain, the fear, but the ache in his leg and the dried blood on his hands reminded him it had all been real. He sat up slowly, grimacing as his muscles protested. The storm had moved east, leaving behind a wet silence that made every sound echo. He could hear the distant trickle of rainwater dripping from the pines outside, the soft pop of the dying fire, and the faint rustle of the pup shifting in its sleep. He reached for the melted flash drive resting on the table, holding it up to the light. The serial number he had memorized was now etched into his mind, but below it another detail had emerged: coordinates. Faint but clear, pressed into the metal like a secret meant to be found by someone who had once known how to look. Hollow Ridge. The name came back like a ghost. He'd heard it only once years ago, whispered by another soldier in a hospital tent after a failed extraction mission. "They're moving the dogs to Hollow Ridge," the man had said, half-conscious. "No one gets out from there." Ethan hadn't believed it then. Now he wasn't sure he had a choice. He packed what little he had left, a canteen, the first aid kit, the flashlight, and the flash drive, then wrapped the puppy carefully in his jacket. Its wound was still raw, but its eyes were open again, faintly alert. "You ready, soldier?" he asked softly. The pup blinked once, its tail giving a small twitch. That was enough. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the wet morning. The world outside smelled of pine and earth, heavy with mist. The path down the ridge wound through thickets of fern and moss, each step sinking slightly into mud. The air grew colder as they descended, the fog thickening until the forest blurred into shifting shapes. The only sound was his boots crunching against gravel and the occasional distant call of a crow. He walked for what felt like hours, following the compass on his wrist, the same one he'd used in the war, until he saw the first sign of man-made structure through the haze. A fence tall and rusted, crowned with broken barbed wire. Beyond it stood the remains of a compound concrete buildings slumped under years of neglect, roofs caved in, windows shattered. A faded government seal clung to one of the gates, the words barely legible beneath layers of grime: "Restricted area U.S. property, no entry." Ethan exhaled his breath, turning white in the cold air. Guess we're in the right place. He found a gap in this fence where the metal had been cut long ago, probably by scavengers, and slipped through with the puppy tucked under his arm. The compound was deathly silent, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. His boots echoed faintly on the cracked pavement as he passed through the courtyard where old vehicles lay rusting in rows. An overturned Jeep, its tires half buried in moss, bore the same unit insignia that had hung from Luna's collar. His chest tightened. He remembered the day those units were formed, a classified experiment, combining canine rescue operations with enhanced field conditioning. They had called it Project Resolve, meant to train K9S for disaster recovery and battlefield triage. But the program had been shut down, or so he was told, after a series of unexplained accidents. The memory came back like a knife. The briefing room, the commander's voice, the list of volunteers. He had been one of them, but after the last deployment, the files disappeared, the names erased. He swallowed hard, pushing open the door to the main building. The hinges groaned like a warning. Inside, the air was thick with dust, sunlight slicing through holes in the ceiling. Rows of metal filing cabinets stood like tombstones, their drawers half-open, papers spilling across the floor. The smell of mildew and rust filled his lungs. He set the puppy down gently on a blanket from his pack and began searching. Most of the documents were too damaged to read, waterlogged, burned, shredded by time. But a few pages still bore legible stamps: Unit Designate Rescue Division, 12B Subject, K9 Recon Training Initiative. His pulse quickened. He moved from one drawer to another, stacking files in a corner, scanning each one. There were reports of mission logs, photographs of handlers and their dogs, even medical records. One photograph made him stop cold Luna Younger, strong, sitting beside a handler whose face was blurred by time, but whose posture looked too familiar. He turned the page and froze. The next folder was labeled Ward Ethan Clearance Level Omega, his own name typed neatly across the top. His breath caught in his throat. He opened it slowly, the paper brittle under his fingers. Inside were reports, field notes, biometric readings, mission summaries signed in his handwriting. But what twisted his stomach was the final page, an authorization form bearing his signature approving reintegration of subject Luna into civilian environment trial phase. He stared at it numb. Luna had been part of his unit. He had signed her release, believing she would be placed for adoption after the program shut down. But the notes below told another story: experimental tracking chips, classified neural response training, field abandonment tests. They had never let her go. She had been turned into bait, a test subject for survival protocol, released into the wild to see how far loyalty could carry a creature once stripped of its orders. Jesus. He whispered the word, barely audible. The puppy whimpered softly from where it lay, as if sensing his anguish. He turned, looking at it through a blur of tears. "She didn't just find you," he said hoarsely. "She was looking for me." The realization hit him like a physical blow. Luna hadn't been wandering. She had been running from the very program he had unknowingly helped create. His hand shook as he held the flash drive up to the light again. There was more data in it, deeper files encrypted under layers of code. He didn't have the tools to open them here, but the old terminal on the far side of the room might. He crossed to it, booting it up with the emergency generator still faintly humming. To his surprise, it came to life with a flicker of static. He inserted the drive. Lines of text flashed across the screen, and slowly an old government interface appeared. "Access denied. Level Omega required," it read. He typed in his old credentials numbers he thought he had forgotten, but that returned like ghosts 927. Bravo Ward. The machine paused, then beeped. Access granted. The files opened one by one: mission logs, surveillance photos, communication records. The last folder was labeled simply, The Ridge Incident. He opened it. There were thermal images of the same forest he had just escaped, timestamps, matching the night Luna died. Audio files played in fragments, voices of men, giving orders to intercept a civilian asset. Then came the final image. Luna dragging a small crate through the forest, her body half broken her path, leading directly to the coordinates where Ethan had first found her. The crate had contained the puppy. The mission summary was short and brutal. Subject Luna terminated by field failure. Surviving asset relocated, unauthorized extraction by civilian. That civilian was him. His hands trembled as he closed the file. The truth was heavier than any wound. He had been part of the machine that created her suffering, and now, by some cruel twist of fate, he had become its cleanup. He looked down at the puppy sleeping fitfully by the heater, its chest rising and falling. "They made you too," he whispered, "but you're free now." He tore the flash drive from the console, pocketed it, and limped towards the door. As he stepped outside, the fog around the compound thickened again, curling through the broken walls like smoke from the past. He took one last look at the sign hanging above the entrance, its letters faded but still legible: Project Resolve Loyalty, Beyond Duty. He looked at the puppy, who tilted its head, eyes tired but bright. "No," Ethan said quietly. "Loyalty beyond orders." The rain had stopped by the time Ethan reached the edge of the ridge, but the world below him was still a haze of smoke and fog, the remnants of the storm clinging to the trees like ghosts. His breath came in short bursts as he limped toward the truck, parked half-hidden behind a line of fallen pines. He placed the sleeping puppy gently on the passenger seat, wrapped in the last dry cloth he had then slid behind the wheel. The flash drive felt like lead in his jacket pocket, a fragment of truth, too heavy to hold, but too dangerous to lose. He started the engine, the familiar rattle echoing across the empty valley. For a moment he thought he was alone. Then headlights blinked on behind him. 2, then 4, cutting through the fog in perfect formation. SUVs matte, black, moving fast. He gritted his teeth, slammed the gear into drive, and hit the gas. The tires spun in the mud before catching traction, the truck fishtailing as it shot forward down the winding dirt road. The forest blurred on either side, the puppy whining softly as it braced itself against the seat. "Hang on, buddy," Ethan muttered, eyes locked on the curve ahead. "They're not taking us!" Bullets ripped through the air, shattering the side mirror. He ducked instinctively, gripping the wheel tighter. Another round clipped the tailgate sparks, flaring against metal. His heart pounded, his body moving purely on instinct, the same reflexes that had kept him alive in battle, now pulling him through another one. The road narrowed, twisting around the cliff's edge, one side dropping sharply into a gorge that vanished into mist. He glanced at the rearview mirror. 3 vehicles closing fast, their engines roaring like predators on the hunt. He pressed harder on the accelerator, the old truck groaning but holding steady. "Come on, old girl," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Don't fail me now." The puppy barked once, sharp and defiant, as if it understood the danger. The sound gave him strength. The path ahead curved again, but this time the wooden bridge spanning the ravine came into view, half collapsed from years of neglect, its support beams sagging under the weight of decay. There was no way across, not safely, but there was no turning back either. He slowed for half a second, his mind calculating the odds too fast, and the bridge would give out before he reached the other side. Too slow, and the gunman would catch him mid-span. "Hold tight," he whispered, pressing down on the pedal. The truck surged forward, hitting the first planks with a crack that echoed like thunder. The bridge groaned, splintering beneath the tires, but momentum carried them across. The rear wheels hit the far side, just as one of the SUVs followed its heavier frame, collapsing the center span entirely. The explosion of wood and metal behind him sent shards flying through the air, tearing through the fog. Ethan didn't look back. He kept driving until the road widened enough to stop. When he finally pulled over, his hands were trembling, his chest heaving. He checked the puppy still alive, still watching him with those amber eyes full of trust. "We made it," he said, voice hoarse. "For now." He took out the flash drive, turning it in the dim light filtering through the windshield. The data inside it could expose the project, reveal the crimes buried under decades of silence, but it could also get them both killed. He needed help. Not from the police, not from the military, they were part of the same system. Someone independent, someone who still believed in truth. He reached for the glove box and pulled out an old envelope yellowed with age. Inside was a card with a name written in faded ink, M. Reeves Investigative Journal. He had met her once years ago during a rescue operation overseas. She had been fearless, reckless, even the kind of reporter who chased stories that governments buried. If anyone could get the truth out, it was her. He picked up the radio transmitter still mounted on the dash and turned the dial to the emergency frequency. Static crackled for a moment before a faint voice broke through. "This is Reeves," the voice said. "Who's calling Ethan?" Exhaled in relief. "Reeves, it's Ward. I've got something big, Hollow Ridge, Project Resolve. They're still running it." Silence on the line. Then a sharp intake of breath. "Ward, you're supposed to be dead." "Yeah," he said grimly. "That makes 2 of us. Listen, I have proof I'm heading south. Meet me at the old ranger station by mile marker 22. And Reeves, don't tell anyone. Copy that, she said. Be careful. They'll be coming." "They already are." He tossed the transmitter aside and started the engine again. The puppy lifted its head, tilting it slightly as if it could hear the faint echo of danger outside. Ethan reached over, scratching behind its ear. "You're tougher than you look, soldier," he murmured. The rain began again, soft at first, then harder, turning the road slick. He drove on, following the narrow stretch of highway winding between cliffs. Every shadow seemed alive, every turn a trap waiting to spring. Then, without warning, a figure stepped into the road ahead, dressed in tactical black, holding a rifle. Ethan slammed the brakes, the truck skidding sideways. The gunman opened fire. Glass exploded, bullets tearing through the dashboard. Ethan ducked, pulling the puppy to the floor. He kicked the door open, grabbed the pup, and rolled out into the mud just as the truck was riddled with rounds. He crawled toward the edge of the ravine, heart hammering. The rain made everything slick and treacherous. Another bullet whizzed past, grazing his shoulder. He grunted in pain, clutching the wound. No more running, he muttered. He turned, saw the gunman advancing, and made his choice. He stood holding the puppy tight and jumped. The fall was instant chaos, air roaring past, water rising fast, the world shrinking into a blur of gray. When he hit the river, the shock of cold drove the air from his lungs. He went under, spinning through darkness, his hand scrambling to keep hold of the dog. The flash drive slipped from his fingers, vanishing into the current. Panic surged, everything he had fought for lost in an instant. He kicked upward, lungs burning, breaking the surface with a gasp that tore through his throat. The river carried them downstream waves, battering his body against rocks. He grabbed for a branch jutting from the bank and hauled himself halfway onto shore, coughing water from his chest. The puppy lay beside him, motionless. "No," he rasped. "Not now." Then he saw it clutched between its teeth, glinting in the rain, the flash drive. The dog had caught it underwater, refusing to let go. He stared in disbelief, then laughed the sound half sob and half relief. "You unbelievable little miracle." He took the drive, pressed it to his chest, and whispered, "We're not done yet." The current surged again, pulling at his legs, but he pushed himself higher onto the bank, cradling the pup. The sky had cleared by the time they reached the ranger station, and the cool night air felt like a balm against the chaos of the past few days. Ethan's legs were heavy from exhaustion, his body beaten and bruised, but his grip on the puppy remained firm. Every step felt like it could be the last, yet something about the cold mountain air revived a flicker of hope in him. The station stood ahead, a solitary building that looked like it had been forgotten by time, its wooden frame sagging, its roof warped from years of neglect. A light shone dimly in one of the windows, but the place had the silence of a place abandoned for good reason. Still, the quiet felt like a kind of welcome. He walked toward the door, the puppy cradled in his arms, its body warm but weak. As he stepped onto the porch, the door opened, and a woman stepped out into the moonlight. She was in her 40s. Dark hair pulled back into a ponytail, her face weathered by the years, but still sharp. Reeves, the journalist he'd contacted earlier. Ward, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd seen enough to know when the stakes were real. He nodded, his voice hoarse. "Reeves, this is it." He stepped forward and handed her the flash drive, the one that had caused so much turmoil and heartache. She took it without a word, her eyes scanning his face for a moment before she stepped back inside. He followed her, careful not to jostle the puppy too much, as she led him to a table strewn with papers, maps, and an old laptop. The room smelled faintly of coffee and dust, but it was warmer than the forest, and for the first time in days he felt like he could breathe. She inserted the drive into the laptop and waited as the files began to load. Ethan stood beside her, his fingers clenched at his sides. He had no idea what she'd find, what the world would find, but he knew this was the moment everything had led to. The puppy whimpered softly, resting its head on his boot, its small form a reminder of why they'd fought this far. The screen flickered for a moment, and then a series of files appeared. Reeves clicked through them quickly, her eyes flicking over the documents. Then she stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. "What is it?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. She turned the screen toward him. A photo of Luna appeared alongside a name he hadn't expected to see. Rachel Turner. "Rachel Turner." Ethan repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "You know her. I knew her." Reeves said, her voice cold now. "She was one of the original handlers for Project Resolve, a legend in the field. But she disappeared. Gone without a trace, years ago after the program was supposedly shut down." Ethan's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Rachel Turner wasn't just a part of the program. She had been the architect of it. She had been the one to build the framework that turned dogs into tools for classified operations. And then when the program became too exposed, when things went wrong, she disappeared. Ethan had known her, or at least her name. Years ago, in another life, when he'd volunteered for the program, She had been the one to sign him in to promise that nothing would change. Nothing had ever been the same since. Rachel Turner created this. Reeves continued, her voice now filled with bitterness. She's the reason those dogs were treated as assets, as disposable tools. She was the one who started the covert ops, the real reason they kept Luna and the others locked away. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tightening. But she's not just a name on the file, he said. She's connected to me. The files say I was part of it. Reeves nodded. You were a volunteer, Ward. You were one of the last to sign up for Project Resolve. Your clearance level was one of the highest. She paused for a moment, a dark look crossing her face. But that's not all, is it? You knew about the experiments. You knew about the tracking chips and the neural response tests. You were part of what killed Luna and the others, and you've been running from it ever since. The words hit him like a slap. The guilt, the shame, everything he'd carried with him for years. He wanted to scream, to deny it, to fight back. But all he could do was stand there staring at the screen that reflected the mess he had been complicit in creating. The puppy stirred in his arms, its tiny body pressing against him like it understood his pain. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Reeves broke the silence. We can expose this, she said, her voice hardening. We can put everything out in the open, but it has to be now. This is your chance, Ward. You've carried the weight of this for too long. Ethan looked at the puppy in his arms, its eyes still full of trust. It had been through hell, and yet it still held on. He realized in that moment that it wasn't just about exposing the truth for Luna, for the others. It was about redemption. It was about finally facing the past and setting it free. He turned to Reeves, his voice steady now. Let's do it. Let's bring them all down. Just as they began to prepare to go public, a sudden screech of tires sounded outside. Ethan spun around his body, instinctively moving to shield the puppy. They're here, he said, his voice low. It's too late. They found us. He reached for his jacket, the weight of the gun beneath it a reminder of the fight that was coming. The door flew open, and two men in black tactical gear stormed inside, their rifles raised. But before they could make a move, Reeves stepped forward, her hand on the laptop. This is over, she said, her voice cold, unflinching. You've been exposed. The men froze their eyes, flicking between the three of them. The tension in the room was thick enough to suffocate. Then the sound of sirens broke the silence. The cavalry had arrived, but it wasn't the police. The entire system was about to come crashing down. The men backed away slowly, their hands raised. You don't understand. One of them said, his voice trembling. You can't stop this. But it was too late. The truth was out. The world would know. Ethan looked down at the puppy, its body warm against his chest, and realized that in the end, it wasn't the power of the gun or the strength of the system that broke them. It was the truth and the unwavering loyalty of a dog who had never given up. He smiled faintly, his voice rough. You saved us, little one. The puppy licked his hand once, then laid its head down, finally at peace. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the weight of the past lifting, knowing that the truth would be heard, and the world would finally know what had been done to the dogs, to Luna, and to him. The storm was over. The reckoning had begun. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more thrilling tales. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the plot. What moment stood out to you the most? And tell us, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below.